Following the news of the brutal Israeli aggression on Gaza for the last few weeks. And I know you have done many activities in this regard and in regard of showing solidarity with the Palestinian people. Today, we are happy to host and to welcome Dr. Issam Nassar. Dr. Issam is the head of the history department at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He's going to talk to us about the Palestinian question, about a little bit about the history and the struggle of the Palestinian people. So let us all welcome Dr. Issam.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ustaz Mahmoud, for this invitation, and the Academy and everyone, and for the welcoming remarks. I am sure many of you know a lot of details about the history and the question of Palestine or the conflict over Palestine, and perhaps some of you know a little bit less. So I'm going to try to simplify the history of the conflict more or less in, what do I have, half an hour, I suppose, or maybe less. And to do that, I'm going to have to focus only on a number of themes, and I cannot go into details about a lot of things. Let's see if we... Okay, generally speaking, you might know that Palestine and the entire region of East Mediterranean, or as we call it, Bilad al-Sham in Arabic, used to be part of a large empire that existed until the early 20th century. That empire was known as the Ottoman Empire. So Palestine was one of the many regions of the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, which used to be huge, but right before World War I, it was reduced to what you see here in green, though before that it mostly dominated about 70% of the basin of the Mediterranean. Palestine was a region, as you can see here, that this is an image from the 19th century that shows all the towns and villages in Palestine. So it was inhabited by Palestinians whose main language was Arabic, though there were many minorities, but the lingua franca in the country was Arabic. The official language of the government was Ottoman Turkish. In terms of the population, I guess I'll wait a little bit. In terms of the population, it was a mixed population. Ethnically, we had people, majority were Arabic speakers, natives of the region, Palestinians, or sometimes they refer to themselves at that time as Syrians. But we had Armenians, we had Greeks, we had Assyrians, and we had a number of other ethnicity or ethnic groups or national groups that lived in Palestine as well. In terms of religious affiliation, Palestine was a country of multi-religious representation, so to speak. Majority of the people of Palestine until the early 20th century were about 80 to 85% were Muslims. About 10 to 15%, depending when we're talking about, were Christians. Predominantly Orthodox Christians, but there were also other denominations. And between 5 and 10% were Jews. And here I am talking about Palestine before the Jewish Zionist immigration that started early or late 19th century, early 20th century. So in terms of who are the Palestinians at the time who were Ottoman citizens, they were from all groups, religious groups and different ethnic backgrounds who lived relatively in peace among each other. I say relatively because there were some conflicts. Those conflicts were not between religious groups or even ethnic groups. They were between different landlords, the ruling authorities, etc. So it was like any other country or place that will emerge to become an independent country in the region, including like Syria or Egypt or any other place in the world, generally speaking. Malish, I'm gonna have to do this. You can hear me from here? Yes, okay, so, okay, aside from all that, there was something else happening in Europe that had nothing to do with Palestine. And that was a long history of discrimination against the European Jewry, the Jews of Europe. And that today is referred to as anti-Semitism. At that time, that term was not used. Largely the term that was used, it used to be called the Jewish question. Discrimination against the Jews seemed to be on its way to disappear when there were nation states established, states that promised equality to everyone. But clearly that did not happen. There was still discrimination. There were massacres in Russia. There were discrimination in France, the country of the French Revolution that promised equality among all its citizens. And I will not go into details. There are certain cases. And it was at that point that an author with the name of Theodor Herzl, you can see him here, wrote a book discussing the Jewish question. And he thought that the best solution, thank you, the best solution for the Jewish question will be for the Jews of Europe to be removed from Europe to a place far away from Europe, safe from European discrimination, where they can form their own state. And he justified that by saying, true, we are a religious group, not a national group. We don't speak the same language. We don't live in the same place. But the act of, or the fact of exclusion of Jews in the European countries unified them into a group that is excluded, and this exclusion, as the citation from his book here, enables them or is turning them into a national group. He believed in that. Not many Jews believed in that, but things moved eventually in a direction that kind of went along with his prophecy later on, especially in World War II. But I am ahead of myself. Can I get water, Manish? So he proposed that the solution should be the creation of a state for the Jews. In fact, the name of his book was The State of the Jews. Translated into English as the Jewish state, thank you, but that's a wrong translation. It's actually the state of the Jews. So he was not talking about Jewish in the religious sense, in any sense. And he started to argue in the book, where could such a state be? So he decided that there are a number of potential locations. And he discussed 4 or 5 different locations in the world. He favored 2 of them. One is Argentina in South America, which is, as he argued, was lightly populated, does not have many natives. Most of the people who lived there were Europeans, so it will be familiar culturally to the European Jews coming from Europe. Oh, okay, thanks. And the second place he discussed was Palestine. And Palestine, for him, the main reason was that it is easier to convince the Jews to go to Palestine because Palestine has a history of, is connected with the Jewish historical and Jewish religious and biblical narrative of the Jews. And Jews regularly go to Palestine on pilgrimage. So he thought it would be easier, but he was pragmatic, he was open to any place because the issue was not religion or going back to reclaim our homeland as they call it today or present it today, but it was more of a practical issue. Sorry. As a result of his book, a congress or a big meeting took place in Switzerland in 1897, in which a political organization was established to, particularly for this purpose, of creating a Jewish homeland. You can tell I'm messy, I'm dropping everything. And the result was they established an organization, they called it the World Zionist Organization, devoted to the idea of creating a Jewish homeland somewhere. And they chose Palestine, and they tried to negotiate with different countries, but eventually, at some point, they decided on a territory within Uganda or between part of Uganda and Kenya. But eventually, in 1904, the choice was Palestine. And to do so, they said the best way would be to do it through some to convince a European colonial power that it is in their interest to move the Jews into outside of Europe, get rid of them, and that a Jewish state somewhere outside of Europe will be extremely beneficial for Europe. So the way he went, or the organization, he died by then, the organization went about it is to try to get support from some colonial power or another. And they were in contact with all the powers of the time. Their efforts succeeded in 1917. And 1917 was a year in which it was the third year of what is known as the World War I, or was not called that at the time, but now we call it World War I. They had no idea there will be World War II, so they did not number it in that sense. And this is the Brits adopted the Zionist project and issued this declaration that you must have heard about, called the Balfour Declaration, after Arthur Balfour, who was the British foreign minister, in which he promised, or basically said, that the government of Britain, or His Majesty's government, will support the creation of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. So already national home has the implication of national rights. And he added, on the condition that it does not violate the religious rights and civil rights of the non-Jews in Palestine. And the non-Jews in Palestine were about 90% of the population. So they were already in this promise dismissed from the picture, as they were not called Ottomans or Arabs or Palestinians or Syrians or anything else. And their rights were to be only the right to worship and to have civil rights. And quickly after this, actually 1 month after this, the British occupied portions of Palestine, and over the next few months they will occupy the rest of Palestine and the rest of the Syrian region altogether, and Ottoman control of Palestine will end. And the British entered Jerusalem, as we see here. General Allenby led the campaign, entered Jerusalem in December 1917, and he established a government. It was a colonial government. It was called the military government at the time. But after World War I ended and the peace process, or the negotiations to end the war, took place, and a new organization was created to oversee peace in the world. It was called the League of Nations, similar to the United Nations, but is defunct now, was replaced after World War II. And basically, that League of Nations granted Britain control over Palestine, and it was called a mandate. And that's why we talk about the mandate government, because it was given a mandate by the League of Nations to rule Palestine until it's ready to become a Jewish homeland. So within the legal apparatus of the government that the British will form for Palestine, the idea of a Jewish homeland was clearly there. The next thing that happened is they appointed a sort of a president, if you like. He was an appointee by the British with the title of High Commissioner of Palestine. And the first High Commissioner of Palestine realized that although Britain is going to enable Jews from Europe to migrate to Palestine, Palestine had a large number of population who were not interested in the Zionist project. So how do you deal with this? He dealt with it legally by inventing something that we are stuck with to this day. He decided that in that country, in Palestine, there are two nations. One is the Jewish nation, and the other is the Arab nation. And the Arab nation composes of everyone else except for Jews. So it did not matter if you're Armenian, Palestinian, Turk, etc., who lived there, you're basically an Arab. And the terminology of Jews versus Arabs started there. There was a problem because there were Arabs in Palestine who were Jews. There was no conflict in being Arab and Jew at the same time. There are people who are Arab and Christians. There are Arab and Muslims. And there were Arab Jews. And those people were not Europeans. And the plans of the Europeans to bring Jews to Palestine was seen by them, like the rest of the Palestinians, as colonial plans, European plans for Palestine. So still, nonetheless, they were pushed along the side of the Zionists. So these are some images to show you the diversity. These are all images in the early 20th century, just to emphasize the idea of the multi-religious affiliation of the Palestinians. So we see the Islamic conference over there. We see the two grand rabbis of Jerusalem, the Jewish leadership, and we see Christian priests over there. So I want to emphasize this particularly in light of how we came to think about the conflict as a Muslim-Jewish conflict that goes back to centuries. It does not. It is a conflict between European settlers and the native population of the country. Again, Palestine, in this case Jerusalem, but also many other cities like Nazareth, Hebron, Tiberias, Bethlehem, etc., is significant for all three monotheistic religions of the world. It has sites connected with the biblical narrative of the Jewish biblical narrative. Over here, like we see, this is the Wailing Wall, and it has the holiest church for Christianity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with the tomb of Jesus in there. That's also another image. And it has a mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is part of Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is called the Dome of the Rock. But the location is mentioned in the Quran as the site from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to the sky. So it is a place that is holy for a number of religions. It's not exclusive for one religion, and as such, it could have been a place of coexistence and dialogue between various religions. Now, to move back to the British, they set up the government, as I mentioned, and we can see the images here of British troops. معلش بتقول هاي. Don't worry. تظبط. So I'm just showing you various images, and when we talk British troops, it's important to remember that Britain was a massive empire, and most of its troops came from the colonies. And they were themselves colonized people, but they were in the British Army. So here we see Indian soldiers. In some other images over there, we see Irish soldiers. All of them revolted eventually against the British Empire, but that's the order of the day. And Palestine had very important, massive cities alongside of Jerusalem, which we all know. The city of Jaffa was the largest city in Palestine, was a port city that connected Palestine with Alexandria, with Istanbul, with Syria, with Italy, with the rest of the world. It was the main port of Palestine, and these are all, in this case, images from the 19th century. The population, of course, was diverse, not just religiously, but there were city people, as we can see here. There were peasantry, perhaps the majority were peasants, lived in small villages, producing mostly olives, but also other products. And there were historical locations, there were Bedouins, etc. The British who set up a government in Palestine issued passports and issued currency. But one thing about the British, when they came up with this idea of Arab and Jews, they decided to create two administrations, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. So the Jews who were immigrating by the thousands into Palestine were subjected to a rule that gave them autonomy with their own government that used to be called the Jewish Agency, which had, it was in charge of schooling, of policing, of hospitals. So basically they were building their own state under the guise of the British mandate, leaving the Palestinians living on their own under direct control of the British themselves. Then comes the World War II, which Palestine had nothing to do with, but it will have great impact on Palestine in two ways. One is the Holocaust will change or create massive sympathy with Jews around the world. And Zionism certainly did not speak on behalf of all the Jews in the world, but Zionism manipulated that element by making it clear that if you want to support Jews after the Holocaust, you have to support them to move to Palestine and establish their own independent state. The other element is the Jews of Palestine, who had their own military force, volunteered to fight with the British in Europe. And they created for that a special Jewish battalion that was trained and participated in the war in Europe. So after the war, about 100,000 armed men will return to Palestine to become, basically, they were, their numbers exceeded the British troops that existed in Palestine, and there were no Arab troops at the time except policemen or things like this. So already after the war, we had basically what would become the Israeli army. We had a massive army. And those fighters decided that it's time to get rid of the British and declare the Jewish state in Palestine. So they started to fight not only the Palestinians, but also the British. And the whole situation became a mess, a chaos, that the British, again, you will remember me for this, probably not for the lecture. The British decided that they want to withdraw from Palestine for various reasons. We don't have time to get into it. So they turned the issue of Palestine to the UN. And the UN, basically United Nations, studied the situation and decided that the best solution is to create two states in Palestine, one Jewish and one Arab. And they came up with this map over here, in which these territories will become a Jewish state, and those territories over here will become an Arab state. But that was not an exclusive solution. The solution that they envisioned, those two states will be confederated and will have open borders. And people will not be exchanged. People, if you lived in here, you will be a citizen of the Jewish state. If you lived here, you'll be a citizen of the Arab state, regardless if you were a Jew or Arab or Christian or Muslim. And a small enclave that will be international, in which the holy cities of Jerusalem and Bethlehem will be located. Following this declaration, the Zionist forces, the troops in Palestine, well organized, started a massive campaign in order to reduce the number or to eliminate the non-Jews living in the territories that will become a Jewish state. they started what we would call today ethnic cleansing. This is even before there was the war of 1948. And eventually, on May 14th, 1948, the British officially ended their presence in Palestine. Did not turn Palestine to any government. They simply, the last High Commissioner stated simply, I'm leaving the key under the mat, the key of the government house. So it was that simple. So the war started, or it was already starting, basically composed of Jewish Zionist forces attacking the Palestinians, Palestinians defending themselves with small arms collected in villages. There were no central organization that represented the Palestinians or a military group. And the state of Israel was declared in Palestine, I think I have it here, on May 15th, 1948. And it was described as the state of the Jewish people, which is very problematic. Again, I'll focus on these problematic issues. There is nothing called Jewish people in general. They did not say the state of the Jews living in Palestine. And most states, when they declare independence or are established, they usually refer to themselves as the state of their citizens, the people who live in them. But this was declared a state of the Jewish people, which means Jewish people anywhere they live in the world, not the state of the people who live under its borders. And on the same day, the Arab League decided to send troops to Palestine to end the possibility of the partition of Palestine. But the troops they sent were untrained, they were unorganized, and all of them, from Egypt to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon to Jordan, did not amount to 1/3 of the number of troops, Jewish Zionist troops that were in Palestine. And that was the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict, officially Arab-Israeli, not Palestinian Zionist as before. The war ended in 1948 with Israel, the newly created state, controlling more territories than it was promised or it was supposed to have under the partition plan, as we see here. So all these extra territories were under the occupation of the new state. And the most tragic event is this new state systematically uprooted more than 500, about 540, I suppose the number, villages and towns, uprooted the people who lived there and pushed them across the border into the neighboring countries. And in some cases, they were pushed into territories that stayed in Arab hands, such as Eastern Palestine, which became renamed at the time into the West Bank, and into this small strip of land around the city of Gaza that became known as the Gaza Strip. Between 720 and 800,000, which is about between 60 and 70% of the population of Palestine, overnight, over a few months, became refugees in other people's lands. And immediately we had an increase in the Jewish immigration to Palestine. And on one hand, we had Jewish immigrants coming from Europe, largely, because there was a European project. Eventually, there will be Jews coming from the Arab world, but that will not happen until the 50s. And you had Palestinians fleeing into Lebanon, into Jordan, into Syria, or into the territory that we refer to as the West Bank, and into Gaza. In 1949, 1 out of 10 of the people of Gaza was a Gazan. In other words, 9 out of 10 were refugees, destitute refugees. In 1949, 2 out of 3 in Jordan were Palestinians, not Jordanians. And 1 out of 5 in Lebanon was a Palestinian. So you can imagine the weight, the size of the trauma for the Palestinians, but also the weight it took on the neighboring countries at the time. Refugees were placed in refugee camps established by the United Nations, and the United Nations issued a resolution that called on Israel to allow the refugees to return to their homes. And that is the UN resolution that talks about the right of return, something that the Palestinians hold on to this day. It has never been implemented, as we know. On the other hand, to counter this right of return of the Palestinians, Israel issued a law that they called the Law of Return, which said basically that every Jew in the world, anywhere, has the right to come to what is now called Israel and get citizenship immediately. So on one hand, if anyone who happened to be Jewish in the world can simply go there, become a citizen, but the people who lived there and their ancestors were there for thousands of years have no right to citizenship and have no right to return to their homes. And this is the Palestinian refugee problem, and this is what the Palestinians called the Nakba, the catastrophe of Palestine at the time. I know I'm probably a bit slow. To make things quicker, I'll jump to another war. In 1967, Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, and along with it, it occupied territories from Egypt, Sinai. It occupied the Gaza Strip, which was already under Egyptian control before, and occupied the West Bank, which was under Jordanian control, and occupied Syrian territories known as the Golan Heights. And again, a large number of Palestinians were displaced, not as massive as 1948, but a large number were displaced, and those territories were placed under military control, and Israel started to create colonies, referred to as settlements, on lands that is taken from the Palestinians and the Egyptians and the Syrians, of course, and creating exclusive Jewish communities that are off limit to anyone else. No one can live in these places if they were not Jewish. It claimed all public lands as Israeli lands, and it created a system of economic dependency on of these territories on Israel. And basically, they started expelling activists, imprisoning people without trial, without charges. So the situation was extremely terrible. This is in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And eventually, I'm going to have to move fast. Eventually, there was, and before, even after 48, a Palestinian reaction, but after 67, it was more strong, more clear, and that was the emergence of the Palestinian resistance movement under something called the Palestine Liberation Organization, which will be recognized eventually by the United Nations in 1974 as the representative of the Palestinian people. The situation remained that way, even though eventually we had more countries recognizing the Palestinian right and the UN passing one resolution after another. We also had a peace process, presumably, where Israelis and Palestinians tried to create some sort of peace that failed. But it's important in this instance to keep in mind why all of this failed. If the United Nations said that the Palestinians have the right to return, it said they have the right to establish a state in the occupied territories from 1967. It all failed mostly because of the unlimited support of the United States to Israel. And this is, if you can see the numbers here, Israelis get massive aid, more than any other country, from the United States. There is an American law that says Israel has to have military superiority over any country in the region. Every US president or every person who wanted to run for elections have to give allegiance basically to Israel in order to be elected in some sense. So the United States have been the main obstacle for peace in the region, and it supported and continues to support the Israeli policies, the destructive Israeli policies that have been taking place in the occupied territories. And we see it clearly, of course, with the current war on Gaza, which a significant number of countries are calling for a ceasefire, and people in the world are calling for an end of the war, but the United States is blocking that through its power to veto any resolution in the UN. It has that right, and it vetoed a number of drafts for resolutions to call on an end to this war, or at least to a ceasefire, or a humanitarian ceasefire, temporary ceasefire. So we continue to see the deterioration. I'm not going to talk to you about what's happening in Gaza. You see it on the news. You probably are familiar with what's happening elsewhere in Palestine, in territories occupied in 48 or in 67 in the West Bank, or with the terrible conditions of the Palestinians who still remain in refugee camps in Lebanon and in Jordan, and in not many camps survived in Syria, unfortunately, like the entire Syrian situation, but that's another story. I think it's best, I've given you some historical elements, if I open it up for discussion, because I know time is limited. So if you have any questions, anything I could address, I'll be happy to do so.